welcome to Under the
Thanks.
Skin. David, what do you mean about generational divide teaching at Cambridge University, where you're what are you a professor?
I am a professor of politics. so I meant
by
to
that.
I meant to understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So it's just that thing. So we now know, and I don't think we even knew. I didn't know this. So we're not going to talk about Brexit, right? But I didn't know before that vote that the big divides were generational and educational. So if you look at how people voted, it wasn't class on the whole, it wasn't gender on the whole, it wasn't income. If you could ask two questions, how old are you? Did you go to university? Those would be better indicators of how people voted. So if you work in a university, you're a late middle-aged man, you're teaching 20-year-olds. You're weirdly, even though it's a pretty cosseted place, you're on the front line of the two big political divides. And there's no question, people under the age of 30, they don't just kind of have different interests. They see politics, they see the future so radically differently than someone who grew up like I did sort of through the end of the 20th century. Even though they don't have that different like life experiences from me, it just looks so different. And you sense it all the time.
Do you think that there's an appetite for real systemic change among these people that you're teaching?
Yeah, definitely. There's an appetite for it. There's also a sense that no one knows, what the 10 years, 15 years ahead, what it's going to look like. So when I was a student, you could be radical about politics, you could be really fired up, you could be angry about injustice, but you had this feeling there was a kind of shape to it.
Yeah.
And that if you thought of yourself age 40, you might think, I hope I'm not haven't changed my views by then or whatever, but you didn't think the whole surrounding architecture of it would just be different. I think if you're 20 now, you have a suspicion that it might be. And I don't instinctively have that suspicion, but I think that's partly because I've been sort of attuned by my own background. I try and open myself up to it. I genuinely try and think 10, 15 years ahead, it could be radically different, but I have to force myself to think that.
Are there any indicators that it will be different? For example, has serious change occurred anywhere? Any real alternatives to democracy that are more fluid and that distribute power more, rather than versions of democracy that are less fluid and concentrate power?
So not yet. I mean, that's part of the challenge here. I mean, there's definitely evidence that people at a local level where they have more direct opportunities to experiment in some cities, in some countries, there's a sort of radical experimental feeling to it, but nothing that's kind of scaled up, nothing that's gone national. And you can't look at any established democracy anywhere in the world. Not only have they not changed, they look increasingly frozen. I mean, I think that's the real challenge. It's not just that, again, I think it's different from when I was a student, which is you took the system for granted, but the system actually was capable internally of changing. There would be big shifts in ideas and philosophies and the kind of people who were in charge. And now the systems look really stuck. I mean, I think they look more stuck than they look broken. So people are trying to think round them, but it's really hard to see round them. It's really hard to see round representative democracy. It's this big looming 100-year story you've got to see round.
Do you think that ossification is a response to reduced power, as in an increasingly globalized economy, it becomes the role of national governments to service the interests of these transnational institutions?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, definitely part of it is a kind of increasing mismatch between democracy, the great empowering system, the thing, people are told you have to vote, you have to take part because this is your opportunity to change things. The rhetoric of the politicians has to be that too. You don't say vote for me, I'm not going to be able to change anything. And yet the reality is increasingly, I think, that it's hard. It's not just the scale of the issues is hard. So many institutions, political, non-political, kind of snare politics. But it's very, very hard for anyone to come along and say that. Especially to say that and get elected. Vote for me. I'm the one who understands how powerless I am.
Sounds quite appealing, actually.
To say that?
When you say it now, I think that if someone said that, I'd be interested in if someone said vote for me and I will demonstrate in real time the impotence of an elected politician and how illegitimate and meaningless.
I mean, it's definitely true. You often hear people say, why can't the politicians say to us it's hard? You know, like why won't they admit it's complicated? Actually, I think they do admit that quite a lot, but what they won't admit is that they're powerless. That's much, much harder for them to do, I think.
Yeah, the limitations. It seems like it operates on several levels. Like from perhaps it became more clear, though this must have been the case ever since power has operated. It became more clear that we were dealing with spin doctors and managing narratives and stories. And now I feel like that when we see political figures engaging publicly, that I almost want to go, are you all right? I don't feel like that they're able to be human anymore. Or when you see sort of a relatively high politician resign, like Nick Clegg, I remember thinking that the next day he looked like he'd been unplugged from some sort of toxic device that prevented him from making proper eye contact.
You see it with, Theresa May is interesting because you see that, like, if anyone has demonstrated a kind of powerlessness, it's her, and it has attracted sympathy. When you talk to people, they sympathize with her on a human level. I mean, I don't know if you, and even like angry young students, there's a sort of sympathy. It's quite hard not to sympathize with her, and at the same time, there's this kind of fury and frustration with her inability to get things done. But there's something about her. She's almost, I suspect, in the future, she's going to symbolize something if we are moving to something else. That if ever there was a politician who was the conventional sort of 20th century politician who's just hit the limits of what you can do, and people are like, oh, at the same time as wanting to really give her a hard time.
Yeah, on a human level.
Do you sympathise with it?
Completely. I sort of think, you like, God, you must be exhausted.
Yeah, your voice has gone again. Yeah.
Get a blanket, for heaven's sake. Start handing out
so the
blankets.
Politician, the blanket, that's the other one that you could.
Yeah, that's what I feel like. So, okay, so if you, like, in your position as a professor at Cambridge, where you, as you put it, you're on the front line dealing with young...
I mean, front line, it sounds a bit, you know what I mean, right?
Yeah,
it's obviously it's not the actual front line. It's just...
Yeah, I get you. I mean, you're experiencing that disjunct between, like, I recognise what you're saying, that in the sort of 70s and 80s and even, around even up to the Occupy movement, you'd say, what needs to happen is these existing institutions need to listen more to ordinary people. Now what it feels like is these institutions are irrelevant. And we need to establish new ways of organising power and managing society. And that's increasingly, in my own limited research, which essentially amounts to sitting across to people who know more than me, such as yourself, across this table, people are saying new systems are beginning to emerge, new ideas are beginning to emerge, and many of the things that we're assessing as a problem are merely symptoms, whether it's the emergence of the alt-right, 5 years ago, voter apathy, or whatever it is. These are understandable reactions we can now recognise to political systems that are not capable of responding to people's requirements. So maybe we should do a bit more about that, because you have written loads of books that, like, it might be good to get a précis on, so we set things out before moving on to the inevitable bit where I say things like, and how's anarcho-syndicalism going to replace this, and what's the role of spirituality and community.
Yeah, we will get there.
Yeah, we'll get there, but let's do a little bit more on is How Democracy Ends your most recent book?
Yeah.
Give me I've read some of it. Tell me though what it's about.
So it is partly a reaction against all the other books with similar titles, which say that we've got to remember how democracy ended in the past. The shorthand version of it is there are lots of books out there saying the worst case scenario here is we're going to rerun the 1930s. Like, the thing that we should be frightened of is fascism. I agree we should be frightened of fascism. It's a frightening thing. I don't think we're rerunning the 1930s. I think the question about how democracy ends is a question about the future, and almost everyone sees it as a question about the past. So it's natural. What human beings do is, like, if you're lost, you look for something familiar. So we look for the death of democracy because in the 30s the fascists took over, you get a military dictatorship. We see it around the world, the generals take over, or you get some strong man who suspends the rule of law. And the basic argument in my book is that that may be true still in some places around the world, maybe many, but not for us. By us, I mean mature Western democracies. We're nothing like that anymore. We're completely different kinds of society. So we have these institutions that go all the way back to the 30s, but we're living in a completely different world. We're much older. So the breakdown of democracy in the past tended to happen in places both where the democracy was young. So in the 1930s, I don't think you can date what we call democracy much further than 100 years back. Like, you know, everyone has to have the vote for a start, men and women. So in the 30s, these institutions were like a decade old. And then the people who lived in these societies were young too. So these were mainly societies of young people, including lots of young men. So we've now got misfiring democracies in societies where the institutions are 100 years old. So they're old, they're tired, they're stuck in their ways. I say it's like a midlife crisis, kind of midlife crisis if you're quite old. And the people are old. These are societies where most people are middle-aged or older. You go back 100 years, Britain, America, were societies of children and young people. So the median age, the age above which, 50% above, 50% below. 1930s America was 24, 25. So half of everyone in America was either a child or a young adult. It's now 40, and although life expectancy in America, there are problems around that, but there are more old people. There are 20% plus people over 65 now. It used to be below 5%. You cannot, you get fascism in societies of angry young men. We've got lots of angry young men, but we've got a lot more angry old people. And I'm not saying I know how it's going to go, but it's not going to be a playing out of the past. We're older, we're richer, we're healthier, we're more networked. We're still very unequal. We're tired. We're used to this way of doing politics. It's not meant to be an optimistic or a pessimistic book. It's meant to say, if democracy is going to go wrong, do not think it's going to repeat. It's just not.
There's no reason really to assume. I'm sure there are patterns in history, of course, but it's unlikely that we would revisit such a relatively recent period when, as you say, conditions have altered quite radically, just the base conditions. And that makes sense to me, what you're saying about that you would need a large population of angry young men. Although I suppose that's some of the vivid images of new nationalistic politics that chimes with that.
Yeah, and that's part of the issue here is that you can get these images and it's really uncanny. It looks the same. Frankly, the politicians sound the same. I'm not denying for a moment that the rhetoric of authoritarian politics now sounds uncannily like the worst rhetoric of the 30s. And we are revisiting the racism, the anti-Semitism, the suspicion of outsiders, the suspicion of experts, all of that. Yeah. But if you're doing it against these completely different background conditions,
can't have the same result.
Yeah, and you say, which I'm sure is true, that history doesn't repeat, and yet there are these books being written by really smart historians where you haven't got anything else to go on because the future's this kind of unknowable thing. I think it's more unknowable than it used to be. I think if thinking 20 years ahead is harder than it was even 20 years ago, you're more and more dependent on the past to kind of anchor where you are. And so the argument of my book is to try and, it's a sort of argument about political imagination. What if we started from the assumption, the common sense assumption, it's not going to repeat, but it might be in real trouble. We need to open our minds up to the thought that the future could be something we haven't even begun to consider.
What type of prognosis or what kind of speculations do you offer?
So there is definitely a possibility that there is, again, which wasn't really on people's radar 10 or 15 years ago, that there is a workable alternative to democratic politics, which is the Chinese system. It probably wouldn't work for a society like ours because we've got all these entrenched institutions and beliefs. But something that's potentially going to spread quite widely and is quite possibly quite durable, and it's not democratic. I mean, it has democratic bits to it, but it's basically an authoritarian system anchored to a view of capitalism. That, even 10, 15 years ago, there was this thought that there weren't any alternatives because the alternatives had to be these kind of ideological alternatives, communism or whatever it was, and all those ideas were kind of played out. And now we're seeing, well, you could have a kind of pragmatic, they call themselves communists, but they're not. You can have a pragmatic alternative, which is sort of technocratic expertise plus authoritarian control, plus possibly the use of new technology to deliver results and also to monitor citizens, and that we shouldn't assume that might not outlast us.
No.
So that's the bleaker view. I mean, I'm not. And one of the ironies of it is that we tend to think that if there's going to be an alternative, people in our society have to be advocating it. There still are people who want us to be communist, whatever. And through the 20th century history of democracy, there was always the thought that democratic societies were challenged by big ideas that some people were pushing from inside those societies. Almost no one in Britain or America is pushing that we should adopt the Chinese system.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because a sort of state authoritarianism allied with capitalism is the most successful model. Like that's currently that's what's working best. So it's surprising that no one is saying, hey, why don't we do a version of this? We'll be in charge. I suppose it's because it sounds so awful. Like, if you grow into it, like, right, we had communism, now we're doing this thing where you get more phones. Okay, cool, more phones than we used to have, that's right. And before that, you were peasants.
And it's weird, in a way, the only people you hear advocating it are the ones, so I know people who are really worried about climate, say, and really frustrated with Western democracy and its inability to grip this issue. And then they go to China and they see this authoritarian, technocratic system doing really decisive things, not consulting, because you don't have to consult, not being sort of subject to electoral cycles and big public opinion consultations. And there is, you see people come back with this kind of look in their eye, which is, I've seen, a way you could do this, which is you just do it. And this, I don't know, I never know what I think when I see that.
Like, for example, started to use green energy, and they're just, we're going to be doing that. It's dangerous.
We're going to do it. And we're going to do these things on a scale that it would be impossible in a democracy, because we think we roll something out, it takes us 20 years. They just do it.
But what the suggestion is, David, that's not because of the opposition of the populace, that's corporate opposition. And you need only take this sort of anecdotal example of China's relationship with tech companies is more adversarial than any Western nation would dare to have. You wouldn't have England or France or America saying Google better not try this and Facebook better not try that.
But the Chinese have their own versions of Google and Facebook, and that relationship with the state is frighteningly close. I mean, that's the thing. So there's this kind of adversarial relationship with the Western or the marketized version of this.
It's an odd permutation of the leftist idea that the only oppositional force to corporate power can be state power, isn't it? That, when I've spoke to, say, sort of like David Harvey, and I said, why do we have to have some sort of centralized state power to some parental state power? And he seemed to believe that without regulation, the forces of globalization and corporatism would crush the populace. But when you brought up the example of China as an alternative to the kind of democracies we're familiar with, obviously naive fool that I am, I was imagining the first thing you'd say is, well, I imagine that we'll have democracies where power is a lot closer to the people that are governed by
I'm coming to that.
You're working towards that.
You're
just teasing me with the dark dragon forces of China.
I think you have to take seriously that there is out there a real alternative, and it is scary. And one of the reasons it's scary is that in that system, state power is basically merging with that form of corporate power. So if we want an alternative, the Chinese is a sort of potentially a morality tale about the dangers of a really powerful state that actually does try and take this technology seriously. But there are much more radical alternatives too. So there's a kind of big looming real world alternative, and then there are all these bubbling alternatives within the West and also sort of around the world, like I say, at city level, that use this technology not to kind of merge with state power, but ideally to empower people and give people some more direct control over their lives. And that's bound to grow. I mean, there's no question that this technology is going to empower people in ways we haven't even thought about yet. But between these two, so you've got one big bad thing out there potentially, you've got all sorts of bubbling experiment going on. But the thing that's in between them, which is the Western democratic state, is not going away. That's the big challenge, right? So it's almost like we've got to think round this thing And we also got to take seriously that it's not just going to wither away. It doesn't show any signs of giving up. It's stuck, it's frozen, but it's not giving up the ghost. And that's the big challenge, I think, to think sort of through it and round it.
But when you talk about these 20-year-olds that you are involved in the education of, it's sort of, for me, it seems conceivable that within a generation there could be significant change, because if like a large number of educated people believe that different things are possible, then when they're presented with those alternatives, they won't just instinctively say, no, this isn't possible, that capitalism's the best of all the worst alternatives. They won't just default to those to the stasis that's defined the last sort of 50, 60 years. They're open to these kind of possibilities.
I definitely think that they're open, and I definitely think they also, the other irony of being 20 now is, if you live in if you're going to Cambridge University, you're a sort of, relatively speaking, affluent person. Your life expectancy, who knows what it is, right? Who knows how long ahead you should be thinking. It could be 120, it could be 150, God knows what it is. So you've got this kind of enormous arc of a life ahead of you in which it's really hard to think even 15, 20 years ahead. And both personally, thinking about a career or a kind of a way of life that you want to adopt, all the things that when I was 20, that the shape of a life looked familiar, that you even life expectancy, you just had a kind of 20 to 70 period, which when you did stuff. And now I think that's all open too. So it's kind of longer and shorter at the same time. On the one hand, you could think, I might be alive in the next century if you're 20 now. And on the other hand, you think, I can't imagine the next decade, really. The 2030s, that's really hard to imagine. I haven't got that mindset because I'm not 20, but I imagine if you did, the possibility of quite soon having a really radically different imagination about politics is real. I
wonder how significant a proportion of the population educated 20-year-olds are. There's probably, I would imagine, a little bit of a decline, isn't there, in people going to universities? It feels to me like
it's leveled off, but it's still so much higher than it was.
Really?
So even 50 years ago, it was between 1 and 2% of British people went to university, which is why it wasn't a divide in our politics, because there weren't any university education. They were doing the politics, but they weren't a division in the electorate because there weren't enough of them. And now then it went up to about 15, 20% through the 80s. And now among the under 40s, it's about 45%. So it's become this big divide, a kind of 50-50 divide. That's why I said at the beginning, you've got the educational divide and the generational divide. And, the young people I teach are on one side of the generational divide, but then they're also on the other side of the educational divide. They and me are in the same position educationally, and there's a 50+% of the population, more among older people, who don't seem to share whatever it is that happens at university that gives people a certain set of attitudes. We don't know enough actually about what it is. Why should a university education be the big determinant of how you vote on Brexit? But it was.
Possibly you feel more equipped to deal with, in a sense, it's a conservative position to vote to remain in a very literal way. You want
it's the status quo position, yeah.
Yeah. And perhaps you feel more comfortable with that if you're in a position like you don't feel necessarily the rage, anger, disappointment, fury, impotence that you might feel. That if you're not economically invited to the party or geographically, or culturally invited to the party, maybe that's what it feels like.
Because I think another thing that's different about now, there isn't a historical parallel for it, is so we have a parliament that is not quite universally, but close to it being an entry requirement that you have to have been to university. It's 90% plus of all MPs have been to university. It's same in American politics. Every senator in the United States has been to college. Every governor has been to college. So it's kind of like it's a job requirement. And then you've got a population, half of the population are like that too, among the younger group, and the other half aren't. And I think both groups have a kind of reason to be really frustrated. So if you're if you're in the educated lot, you look at the politicians and think, well, they're no different from us. Once upon a time when very few people had that kind of education, there was this sense that politicians were a genuine elite, for better or worse. And now you look at them and they're just like large sections of the population. And then there's another group who feel doubly excluded because they're nothing like them. And then they've got that whole group of electors who are kind of in the same boat as them. And so you could say there's a reason for both the educated and the people who haven't had a university education to think this system doesn't work for me. One lot because we're no different from the politicians, and the other lot because there's no one like us among the politicians.
Did you see Steve Bannon addressing the Oxford Union? And yet you call yourself an educated man.
I do.
No, Steve Bannon.
I'm sure I could watch it on YouTube.
Yeah,
right?
That's where I watched it. No, like I was astonished because it was about an hour in before I stopped nodding. Like yeah, that's true. Yeah, I agree with that. He does. It's a
slow build to
it's
the
an incredible
payoff.
turn. Yeah, like that's. He didn't even do the payoff. Actually, he never says a bit where you go, oh right, so who do we blame? Like it starts off with this brilliant, what do I want to say, dissection of the financial crisis and a meeting between Obama and these sort of Wall Street heads and how they decide and determine to set up quantitative easing and all this kind of stuff. He's like wet from the rain. You can hear the people, the protesters chanting outside in the street. Steve Bannon, for those of you who don't know, sort of one of the sort of key figures in the election and advisory of Donald Trump, and sort of someone who said that Tommy Robinson is the backbone of this country. Anyway, so like he's sort of wet from the rain, the chanting's outside, and he says, no, like to this, room full of Oxford undergraduates, you're never going to own your homes. You're never going to own your homes. And like, because the elites have got it sewn up. And like, I can't do justice to what that man did in that room, wet from the rain, and kind of, what do I want to say, committed and determined against the chance outside. And one thing he said that I'd like you to help me to analyse is, he said, the future, he says, is populist. Populism is coming. All we're discussing is whether or not it's right-wing populism or left-wing populism. Now, of course, there's many, many possible alternatives. But something about this idea of populism struck me as interesting. For one thing, David, because I feel like I understand the resurgence of nationalism when people feel that globalisation has taken away their power, the corporations have taken away the power, and the more visceral threat of immigration. I get that. And I also see how populism will become, like, in an age of mass communication and an age where there's so much mistrust of the media and so much mistrust of institutions, and people do have access to podcasts and YouTube and can watch people that sound a lot more like them, and even they don't sound like them, seem to be expressing the same emotion as them. The sort of the resonance of hearing angry people when you're angry seems to be effective. And when he said that about populism, I think he's right. And we should be thinking of how do we build a progressive, liberal, left-wing populism, effective and interested in redistribution of wealth, in genuine new ideas, in accepting that the agitated people that would, the Brexit people that would vote for Brexit, that they have real and genuine concerns that need to be addressed.
And I need to, I don't think I agree that the future is necessarily populism. And I think there is, in populism as it is currently now, this kind of basic problem, which is populism is trying to recapture democracy and deliver for the people who feel excluded through all of the existing institutions. So the populists are not coming along. They're not revolutionaries. They're not actually anti-democrats. It's all in the name of the people. They're trying to win elections. I mean, what's Steve Bannon doing? He's just going around the world as an election consultant, trying to get the League elected in Italy, and he's offering his services to people who are trying to win elections. So there's still this kind of, the future's this potentially radically different thing, but it's going to be channeled through the existing institutions. And the big threats to democracy in the past were going to tear the institutions down. Donald Trump,
communism and fascism.
Yeah. Trump is not threatening to tear. I mean, he's potentially attacking some of the sort of liberal pillars, but he's not threatening to abolish any of the basic structures of democratic politics. He's going to recapture them from the people who stole them from the people. So the liberal version of that, in a way, it ought to be possible because you're defending the institutions, but you're sort of offering something fresh for the people who are frustrated and angry. But it's also just a version of the problem all populists have. I mean, I think the thing that really strikes me about contemporary politics is people are so angry. People are doing some pretty radical things on the left and on the right. But the institutions aren't changing at all. And people aren't really even talking much about changing the institutions. I mean, there's still this underlying assumption on left and on right that the next election will be the key event that will kind of get us wherever we want to go. And we know that's not true because we've been through a lot of these elections. And you get these people elected and then you've got these institutions which are tired and they're kind of stuck. They're in a rut. And you put your radical populist in that framework. And in some places they can start to undo the institutions, but in most places they just increase that feeling of paralysis.
The transcendent trends continue unabated throughout the sort of vacillation between leftist or rightist.
Yeah, and actually one of the themes of my book is that we could go on quite a long time like this. So there's always that feeling that we can't carry on like this. It's going to break, that at some point, again, because we think of the past, democracy will just sort of snap in two, or someone will come along and either kill it or rescue it. It's this sort of either or. We're going to be saved or we're going to be doomed. I think we could carry on waiting for the next election for 20 or 30 years. Because as soon as one election's finished and people are frustrated and angry, they're waiting for the next one. Yeah. And what's the point at which people will say, we need to stop waiting for the populist electoral saviour and actually completely change the way we do this politics, make it more consultative, deliberative, direct, whatever, make it more decentralised, make it more local, make it more international. But we don't. We're still in that phase, which would be completely recognisable to someone 50 years ago, where we just think it gets channelled through quite a narrow set of institutions, parliaments, electoral cycles. And the populists are playing that game. So unless Steve Bannon means, but if you look at what he's doing, trying to get his guys, and they're all guys, I think, trying to get his guys elected, he's not breaking the mould at all. Yeah,
you're sort of right, because actually what he cited as the left-wing populists were Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. So he wasn't saying like some mavericks who are operating in sort of bandit masks. On the
and I know that many of the people, the young people who are thinking most radically about politics are also waiting for Bernie, waiting for Jeremy, which I think is a mistake.
Why?
Because I think even if they win, what you should be doing now is not thinking about who's going to come and save us and who's going to come and save us through this system, but why is this system over the last generation just kind of ground itself down in this sort of ever smaller and smaller circles of not getting things done. And yeah, it's possible. It is possible that Bernie Sanders could become president of the United States and find a magic wand that gets all the institutions working again. But I don't believe it.
Nor do I. I completely agree with you. And what I feel just then is that when you sort of say, is democracy working, it depends what the objectives of democracy are. It depends if the objectives of democracy are what we sort of loosely interpret them to be, to distribute power and to demonstrate the will of the people. If we for a moment discard that as the intention of democracy and say that the function of democracy is to create a veneer of interaction between power and the population while ensuring that the interests of the powerful are never interrupted, then democracy is working extremely well, because that is what it's doing. And I think you're right. And I don't see examples of where democracy is like, right, we're going to step in and control the interests of the power. That never ever happens. You never see that happen. That's not a story that I'm familiar with.
So I think you never see it happen with this sort of set of institutions and ways of doing politics, which have come to be called democracy. So we've come to call democracy something which is a pretty recent phenomenon. It has various building blocks. So it has political parties, often mainstream political parties, and some systems centre-left, centre-right, or a broader spectrum. But professional political parties, professional politicians and party organisers, mass media communication, universal franchise, so everyone gets the vote. So voting is the most important thing, and voting is really important. I'm just not sure it's always the be-all and end-all of democracy. A welfare state, a certain kind of system of redistribution which is moderated in various ways, the rule of law, all of that whole package, and we call that democracy. That is at most in one or two places 100 years old, but in most places it's barely a generation old. Even in Spain or Greece or places like that. It's a really, exactly. It's a really contingent, relatively young thing. And then there's this thing called democracy, which is a sort of 2,000 plus year story, which is the basic idea, that human beings are equal, that all human beings in some way are capable of deciding their own fate, that long story. So I think we could be at the end of the short story.
Yes.
I mean, why not? It's if something's 40 or 50 years old, there's a fair chance it's not got that many more decades left in it. It's unlikely to be going to go on for another 2,000 years. But the long story, it's really unlikely we're at the end of that story. And yet our mindset is that the short story is the whole story. And I think that's a big, big problem.
You're quite right. I mean, in a sense, it's a return to those more pure ideals that's required, an actual democracy that is facilitates the requirements of a large number of people. Now, when I talk about one of a subject around which I know little beyond the name of it, Anarchosyndicalism, I feel like
I'm not going to claim to be an expert either.
But it comes up a lot because what I feel like I mean, and dictionaries are available, so is the internet. So I don't know why I've become arrested at this point by Anarchosyndicalism, is that institutions, communities, organisations, more manageable in size, like for example, a school or not even a county, a borough, could be democratically run by the people that live, work there. Clearly, from talking to sort of like tech futurists such as Yuval Noah Harari, we start to understand, oh wow, the job market's going to change, and possibly that's a good thing. Perhaps it would be a good time to start considering that the value of human beings may reach beyond the way they can economically contribute to a society. So do you feel that we could be promoting ideas of cooperative democracy, like confederacies of smaller groups, challenging the state power as the centripetal force in the way that we see politics?
So I do, but I think I'm probably more sceptical than you about some of it. I think one of the challenges is that politics always gets presented as tends to be sort of either or. Couldn't we do this rather than that? Couldn't our democracy be more really democratic rather than less? And the future's probably both ways. I mean, I think that the future's probably in some respects going to be less democratic than it is now for everyone, for sort of Harari-like reasons. In a sort of world controlled by who owns the data, it's quite hard to imagine some fundamental forces in our lives being subject to democratic control. I don't think there's ever going to be democratic control of the architecture of the internet. I mean, the internet is going to be run by small groups of people who have forms of technical knowledge. And at the same time, that internet, that kind of web of relationships, could be radically empowering democracy in some places. And a future where people where they live have much more control over their lives and get a say in how they make decisions about the things that affect them all is definitely possible. And it probably goes along with a future where a kind of range of broader umbrella arrangements are just beyond us completely almost. And one of the questions we have to face is, are we willing to make that trade-off? We could cling on to the nation state because the nation state is still a thing that might give us some hold over the big international architecture. But it's possible that by clinging on to the nation state, we don't allow these more community-based forms of democracy to thrive. I just think there's a kind of dilemma out there that we're going to have to face, which is if the democratic package isn't working, are we willing to give up on some of it to really empower other bits of it? I don't think we're going to get a future where we turn that package into a genuine democracy all the way through.
In a way, what you're saying is not as radical or disheartening as it might initially
No, it's not, and it's not meant to be disheartening.
Because it's probably already happening, because the part of the disillusionment and disenfranchisement that many people feel is we haven't got no power anyway, we're not having any impact on, I'm not able to affect my life, so the idea of yielding to a sort of power, to sort of, I suppose you mean by that a sort of some kind of centralised and authoritative institution that umbrellas smaller confederacies of more democratic.
I think that the trend to what's sometimes called technocracy, but the idea that
technocracy,
that sort of so technocracy is not being ruled by the smartest people or the people who know stuff. I think that is meant to be called epistocracy, which is like ruled by the
knowledge.
Exactly, ruled by the knowers, and there are real issues with that too, because I don't think we know who knows stuff. But technocracy is kind of ruled by the engineers, basically, the people who built the system. The financial system is sufficiently complicated now that, on the whole, it's not run by the people who know better than us, but the people who know how it was built, because they can, they know which are the levers. Doesn't mean that they know what's good for us. It doesn't mean that they know what will make us happy. But they're like the plumbers, that they're the ones who actually know where the faults are. I think that trend is inexorably going to continue in an increasingly complex and technologically interdependent world. And we could try and resist it through the nation state by trying to elect populists who say, enough of the experts, enough of the people who... And that's one route. This is sort of where we are at the moment. Or we could, at some level, accept it's bound to be part of our future and ask the question, what in that world would be really genuinely empowering for us? And I suspect it's not national politics. I suspect it's not party politics. I suspect it's not having professional politicians take decisions for us. I suspect it is some form of community democracy.
Yes, because I think if you invite people to consider what is it that our lives are affected by, what is it that you want control of, influence over, it's even something as I've previously said, visceral as immigration is, I would say, broadly irrelevant if you in fact had control over what you did on a daily basis, the way that your family's time was spent, those are kind of, these for me don't, the conversation has migrated away from practical life and has become this ideological life of, well, I don't like that, I don't agree with that, I intuit that voting this way means an expression of this thing, rather than a kind of, no, when I wake up at 8 on a Monday, I want to do that, and then by Tuesday I want to be doing that. People don't, I think that's been off the agenda for so long, the idea that we could have lives that are grounded in community and leisure and meaningful interaction and self-betterment and knowledge and education and learning more about ourselves and one another, like sort of utopian visions, but sort of perhaps locally practiced. I feel that that's not something that people consider. Now, when when momentary challenges have appeared to the status quo, I mean in the form of, say, Syriza or Podemos, that in a sense it supports what you've been saying so far, David, in that they're quite easily subsumed into pre-existing systems. Those, like, by collaborating with those systems, by trying to operate within them, parties such as Syriza or Podemos that say, like, hold on a minute, we're going to give a voice to the people, I'm a different type of politician, look, I've got long hair, I'm handsome, look, for example. Those, they're quickly devoured by the fanged vagina of the dark mother democracy.
Yeah. I mean, so the bit I'd object to is not that last bit. It's the I don't think you can say it's they become sort of collaborators with this system. I just think genuinely across the board, these institutions, now that they are so well established, and again, it's a difference between what this might have been like earlier in the 20th century and what it's like now. It's incredibly hard for any politicians once they start being in the vote-winning business, because there's so much that goes around it now. There are so many well-established ways of doing politics that it's incredibly hard to break, that even the most radical voices, they just find what all politicians find, which is you're not in control
You
very
won't
quickly.
get votes there saying that.
No.
You'll have to say that while you're there.
Yeah, and it's not even just sort of that they'll be some sort of spin doctor will take them in hand and beat the radicalism out of them. It's just that with the best intentions, Syriza, Podemos, all of them, they're being funneled through this narrow sort of gap, and that out the other side is meant to come an alternative future, and you never really get through with that politics. I think that's where we are at the moment, and it's really hard for any politician to think outside of that. I think anyone who kind of does politics at the national level, just the sort of brain space isn't there to think round the other side of the institutions. You just go through them, and once you go through them, you're in them and you don't come out the other side.
Yanis Varoufakis, when I spoke to him on this podcast, he explained it as like that. He goes, if you are the German finance minister, you have the power of your role. That is your power, and that role's power is sort of ring fenced. You can't suddenly go, I'm going to tear this up or kick that over. You do what the German financial minister does.
I think his book Adults in the Room is the best sort of primer as to what it's like to kind of go in with those intentions and to have them beaten out of you.
Because they say, well, no, if you do this, this will happen. And in the end, if you are an idealist, it's like, all right.
Yeah. And after all, he was only there for 6 months. I mean, that was how long it took. And he quit rather than...
Yeah.
Whereas his boss...
And isn't his general feeling that his boss sort of, like, I'll try and work with the system from within?
And the IMF have just praised Greece as the new poster child for what you can do if you tough it out. They're saying Greece is now back on track. Prosperity's around the corner.
Yeah, whose track?
You gave me a look there.
No,
I don't know, but it's whatever the worst case scenario was. And again, that's part of the challenge. So with Greece, and I actually write about Greece in my book, all these fears that Greece is where democracy was going to break. Greece has got a fascist party, an old-fashioned fascist party in Parliament, Golden Dawn.
Always got quite nice names.
Yeah,
Golden Dawn. Sounds like, okay,
yeah,
what do you believe in? Yeah. Well, it's pretty bleak.
Yeah. And lots of young people vote for Golden Dawn, but there just aren't any young people in Greece.
They might not have researched the policies. They might have just thought, well, it sounds like a breakfast cereal. I'll vote for that.
They've channeled the anger too. But Greece didn't break. It's sort of back, quote-unquote, on track. And that's the goal, to hold this thing together. But I don't think it was ever going to break. I don't think contemporary Greece, which is it's a very elderly society. It's one of the oldest societies on earth. The median age, I think, is 47 now. It's basically a pensioner society. People have stopped having kids. It's rich, Greece, now.
You think it's very significant, the old median age?
Yeah, I really think it matters.
I know, because you're always mentioning it.
Twice.
Now, why is that?
Twice.
It's actually 3 times.
Okay,
You've
3
already
times.
got a file.
Okay, you can cut at least 2 of them.
No, I like it, but I just want to know.
So I think it's one of those. It's one of
us?
those sort of statistics. So partly it's quite simple because it's just sort of half above, half below, and when it moves 40 plus, so you've got societies where, apart from anything else, if the voting age is 18, the old are going to outvote the young every time. And the view of democracy till about 10 years ago was if all the young bothered to get out of bed and vote, they would win. Because it's always been assumed somehow there are more young people than old people. And that was always true. I mean, it's hard, I think, anyone who was alive before now to imagine a society where there are more old people than young people. And that would only be possible if we stopped having children, which we have in lots of places.
Keep the old alive, don't have any more kids.
Yeah, keep the immigrants out. And wait for the robots. Yeah. I mean, that's the Japanese model of the future, right? That's a possible coming version of democracy. And
what's their one?
So wait for the robots.
Wait for the robots.
Because the older the society gets, the more, on the whole, intolerant of immigration it is. Not having any kids. So who's going to replace the 20-somethings? The robots. So there's no historical parallel for that, and it's a completely sort of
slavery.
What for?
Unpaid labour.
Yeah, there's that, but there isn't the kind of we're dying out because we're getting older. We can keep ourselves alive, which we can now for a long, long time. More or less stopped having kids. Still doing this thing called democracy, where if there are more of you, you win. So there are more and more of these older people. And if you were young, you've got good reason to suspect that the system is stacked against you now. And we see it, right? That you can't explain Brexit or Trump or anything without knowing that the old can now outvote the young. So even if all the young people voted, they all got out of bed, all the students, they kind of did last time almost, show up and vote, they lose. Now, this never used to be true. It is true now. And I think when you see these societies and think, well, now half of people, and that means way more than half of voters, way more than half, are in what we would call the middle-aged or elderly bracket. It's a totally different ballgame.
My sense, and perhaps I feel like I'm picking this up more broadly, is that both Brexit and Trump were out of line with, inverted commas, what the establishment anticipated and wanted. I mean, in Brexit, Cameron and the leaders of the other parties sort of campaigned for Remain. So, in a way, these sort of older people, uneducated people, it kind of, they did deliver a
shock.
Yeah.
They did.
Yeah.
And it's a different kind of shock. So it's the unfamiliar shock, which is there are these majorities out there, and in a democracy, if there are more of you, the majority is still the thing. But it was thought that the quote-unquote establishment could kind of channel these things because that the fundamental divisions were party divisions, and that there's a famous line, in the end, the party decides. It turns out the party doesn't decide. If education and age are the big divisions, we don't have a party of the university educated. I mean, maybe Labour is that, I don't know, but I don't think it is. Maybe the Tories are the party of the old, but they don't sell themselves as that. They don't say, they don't have a kind of old person as their symbol. And yet if that's the division, these established parties, they don't know how to manage it. Like the big divides cut across what the established, the traditional order is, which is left has a go, right has a go.
Yeah.
This group of posh people has a go, but they're leftish. This group of educated posh people have a go, they're rightish. So now, what if that whole group, the political class, discovers there is a majority out there that's had enough?
The taxonomies have shifted around the incumbent structures. The lines have altered, as you were saying. And it's possible that I suppose something that's perhaps a foreboding about sort of populism, as it were, is the possibility for an entirely new type of political figure to enter or a political movement rather than figure that's not sanctioned and is potentially unappealing to the establishment.
Yeah. It could happen. I mean, it's the one really successful example, because after all, Trump won by taking over the Republican Party. He didn't invent a new party.
Yeah.
The one person in Western democracy who's invented a new party from scratch, taken over the whole thing, is Macron in France, who's the most conventional, educated career politician type. He's completely
globalist.
He's everything that you thought was the establishment, and he's the only one who's. I mean, it's true in younger democracies and in other parts of the world where, in a way, it's easier to kind of kick over the established parties. But in places where those parties were really entrenched, left, right, Italy, it's happening now too, up to a point.
Like 5 Star?
5 Star, another bunch of educated people, but yeah, and also the League, there's a government in Italy now which is clearly not the conventional establishment government, but it's still coming from the conventional places. I mean, it's still, so Farage and Trump, these are not your conventional politicians, but Farage has never got close to power, and Trump only did it by taking over the only institution that could get Trump to the presidency was the Republican Party. There's no way he could have become president running as Donald Trump.
And the machine that he sat in is the conventional machine. The utensils are the conventional utensils.
Yeah, he's playing it slightly differently. So he did it by using Twitter and so on to kind of, he didn't need to raise so much money because he worked out if you just said outrageous things, you get all the coverage anyway. And he's skillful at certain things that the established politicians didn't work out how to do. But most people who voted for him because he was a Republican candidate.
Yeah.
And if he wins again, it will be, Farage has never got close to Parliament, never mind to power. So yeah, you could, but in a way we should be reassured that those barriers are there. It's really hard.
And how different are these politicians really? Isn't it like the two examples that you're citing? They, in a way, aren't they just different type of orators, and they're not really
Trump and Farage.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump is pretty different, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, he is. He's unscrupulous and devious, and he's a genius of a certain kind of oratory, of a type that you would recognise going back. But if you'd said to me 5 years ago Donald Trump could be president of the United States, I would have said it's impossible. It just could not happen. And now it's just a fact. It's one of those things that you just have to adjust from thinking it's impossible to thinking it's inevitable. You get about 20 minutes to make that adjustment. So I still some days wake up and think it's not possible. But so I think he's a sign that if you take over the party, even Trump can win.
Do you think it's likely that a more localized, like, because on the basis of what we've been saying so far, even like, Corbyn's Labour or Trump's Republican Party, these in a sense are still quite conventional political machines, other than some superficial differences. And even in terms of manifesto, Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't have been considered that radical not that long ago, really. It's just, in a sense, just a marker of how much our social contracts have eroded, that our attitudes to welfare, taxation, nationalisation have altered. And in a way, doesn't that tell us that if, like, there's no or if I sometimes feel, David, that unless a party is nationalising railways and nationalising public institutions and making them more accessible for ordinary people, there's no point in having a nation if it isn't doing that. Then what is it? Like, it's just, a flag and a history? If it isn't about we have these institutions that provide these resources, then what is it doing? If it is just operating at the service of bigger, more powerful institutions.
Yeah, and I think in that short story, that the thing that we've come to call democracy, the capacity to deliver those things, genuine public services and public benefits, was the key to its success. I mean, it is definitely the case that over the second half of the 20th century, in countries like this one, democracy did deliver for many people real benefits. It sort of moved from left to right, but on the whole, it moved towards a sort of social democratic settlement. I mean, certainly during the sort of post-Second World War period, and that was a big part of it. But then in that longer sweep, that's a relatively short period. I mean, that those institutions were able to deliver that.
Yes.
And it did work. It's sometimes called the 30 glorious years, from sort of 47 to the mid-70s. It was a bit of
an apology for the wars.
It was.
Like, we killed quite a lot of you. Have an hospital.
It was a bit like that. And it was also driven by fear. I mean, it was fear. It's the Cold War as well. So it's like politicians will do a lot when they really think that the worst case scenario is that there's an enemy at the gate. So, and I still think there's a sort of legacy there, that we are so attached to this thing called representative democracy, because in the living memory of lots of people, including these older people, it really did deliver. It was an amazing thing. I mean, representative democracy, liberal representative democracy, if you were in the right place at the right time, is the best political system that we have ever had. But you had to be in the right place at the right time. I'm not sure this is still the right time, and I'm not sure that many people were ever in the right place. But it's become the great thing that sort of hangs over us, that we have to be really, really worried that we might undo it or unpick it.
So what you're saying is that we're experiencing decline, but one of the natural reactions to that is, oh no, it's going to be replaced by what immediately preceded it or what interrupted it, i.e. fascism or some other centralised authoritative thing. And we're sort of toying with the idea, aren't we, all of us, that hold on, with all this, with this ability to communicate, with this technology which ultimately, admittedly, rests in the hands of tyrannical giants every bit as powerful and perhaps as toxic as the state institutions that they collaborate with or run in tandem with, that there's a possibility that we could have different types of democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so if you think the two things that democracy delivered when it really worked, representative democracy, made people better off, it made their lives better, and it made them feel like they were heard, like you were listened to. It gives you a voice. So it kind of gives you practical results, and it gives you a sense that your voice counts, even if it's just because you get to vote. And for a period in the second half of the 20th century, putting those two things together was an incredible combination. And now we're living in a world where the results side of it, delivering practical benefit, is really under strain. But the voice side of it is kind of enhanced in lots of ways. I mean, I think people genuinely feel that the opportunity to be heard is greater than it was. Not to get results as a result of being heard, but just to channel your anger, to speak. Communication's been massively decentralized. And then above it is this kind of umbrella set of organizations and institutions which are controlling the architecture of the whole thing. But I don't think we should deny the fact that enhanced voice is pro-democracy in some sense. It's also enhancing some kind of democratic value, that if you can get on a platform, find people to hear you, channel your anger in particular ways, like you say, find a podcast, find a thing on YouTube where someone like you is saying the things that you believe in. I mean, this is democratic. It
is in a sense, David, but I can't help but think that it appeals to sort of one of the, not necessarily a metaphor, but a belief that I have that, of course, anyone can have a YouTube channel, but it's owned by Google. Anyone can have a podcast, but it's likely on the Apple platform. And that the freedoms that we're afforded are freedoms that do not affect or disrupt the interests of the powerful. The democracy that we have is parenthesized with, as long as it doesn't affect the interests of the powerful. And there was a brief moment where enough people, as you've described, this kind of golden age, where enough people were positively impacted that was irrelevant, because, as you said, the conditions of having a sort of the threat of what could happen if the Cold War was lost, and where I said there was a kind of a sense of debt that you've just said, this nation is definitely real, we want you to go and kill those people from that nation, it's definitely not a made up thing. And now the sort of luster, the threat of the Cold War is gone. They don't seem to be able to find a threat that functions in the same way, Islam or China or whatever. And but the thing I would like to say, as we canter towards a conclusion, is that what about people's emotional and spiritual lives? That as you sort of mentioned, that the shifting taxonomies around left and right, the sense that these categories may no longer be sufficient to describe the political landscape. Something I think is that people are disconnected and people are unfulfilled. That along with democracy, the system by which we organise, there is the sort of I would say the sort of insidious ideology that accompanies it. I would say is kind of consumerism. That's a sort of palliative that accompanies a dying, or at least inert democracy, is like, your freedom to consume these products, your freedom to access this kind of entertainment. And I think these are beginning to be exposed as not necessarily placebos, perhaps even worse than that, intoxicants. I feel that, and you saying again that you are in a position to experience regularly these young educated people. When my own interactions with them, and it's not necessarily just university educated in my case, it'll be sort of people from different types of background, is that they no longer hold that dream. They are sort of disillusioned. Even the people that, and I would say that's it, most of us that can't envisage what's going to come next, have no faith in what's existing in current systems of government, because those systems of government are they're atheistic, not atheistic, that's not the right word, they're sort of materialistic, mechanistic. The ideals are stripped away. Ideals have sort of seemed to be kind of dangerous now, in a way, and I feel that people are lacking a certain kind of nutrition, a certain kind of, now that nationalism is seen as toxic, globalization is seen as toxic, identity politics and intersectional politics divisive. I think people are yearning for something. I'm not sure quite where it's going to come from or how it's going to interact with politics.
So I do think that in the sort of success story part of democracy, the bit that may be coming to an end now, but for much of my life was still true, that kind of politics is very mechanistic. I mean, it was designed in a way, it's very artificial democratic politics. There's nothing natural about it. It's politicians performing and going through these kind of artificial ceremonies of elections and everything else. But it was worth it because there was this thought that there was bad stuff out there. People were on the whole living materially very disadvantaged lives, and as where you put your faith in that machine because you wanted practical results that it was capable of delivering. As the whole world has become more mechanistic, as the sort of mechanization of modernity has just crept into all parts of our lives, I think there's an increasing sense that the political machine is just on the side of the machines. And it's not the thing that will protect us from what threatens our ability to live meaningful lives. It's part of the thing that's colonizing our meaningful lives.
Yeah.
And I think that's a relatively recent thing again. I think it's, and I get it. Again, I struggle because it's not just that I remember the earlier bit. I'm still quite attached to it.
Yeah, why is that?
I mean, I really believe that there are lots of circumstances in which a well-functioning democratic state is what you need to protect you from some pretty bad scenarios. We live in complicated societies where when it goes wrong, when the economy fails, when capitalism runs into trouble, the state is the thing that can get you through. But as it's all become this kind of connected mechanization, and we're not quite at artificial intelligence yet, but we're quite close to these different artificial ways of organizing our life, permeating everything. Politics looks like it's just part of that wider thing. And if once you start to see it like that, it's really hard to have faith. It's really hard to have faith that the machine is going to beat the machine. And so you look for something which has non-mechanical meaning. And I get that.
It's like what you're saying about what you said there about, like, we recognise that it's a type of ideological machine, Parliament, or it's a sort of a functioning, bureaucratic machine.
It's a kind of robot.
Yeah, yeah.
These things were designed kind of as robots. They were designed to be, they are artificial decision-making machines.
Yes.
You feed stuff in, people and opinions and votes and information, and you get a outcome which is this policy, that policy, this, that. And some of them work well, some of them work badly, but that's what they are. I mean, that's what modern politics has always been. It's been the efficient decision-making machine. Now, if we're about to enter a world where efficient decision-making machines actually kind of are everywhere, it's hard to have faith in one machine above the others. Particularly
as the sort of the erosion of the authenticity or sort of moral, what do I want to say, sort of valor of that particular machine has been continually compromised by, we'll hand over that to the private sector, we'll hand over that to this sort of uber national institution. It's losing its veracity, it's losing its sense of honesty, and that in accompaniment with which I'd not heard anyone say that before, the sense of the creeping mechanization of all of our lives until our own humanity feels quite cornered. And it was something I was trying to get at before when I was saying people should be supporting systems that are giving them freedom in their actual lives, not do you like this type of sexuality or that type of religion or that type of immigrant or this type, it's like, when you get up, what are you going to be doing? What does it feel like to be you in the world? What are you feeling when you're in your car? What are you thinking when you're walking along a street? What's it like to be you? And because like when in is like Guy Debord talking about like now when you're you are a worker, then you are a consumer, like where is the bit where you are a human being? And that's the thing that I feel like, and that doesn't necessarily, even though I'm a sort of, I suppose to a degree, a religious person, it needn't come from that perspective, because I think a humanitarian would see things in much the same way. When is your essential humanity being expressed? When are you in communion with the people you love? How are you? And I recognise the necessity for a state when I imagine sort of vigilantism or the total decline of society, or remember when that little petrol crisis for a moment and you realise, oh fucking hell, this thing's fragile.
Yeah, or I mean, I don't like to be like, look at Venezuela now. I mean, you can see when a political society breaks down, it is it's grim.
Is it? What's happening
in Venezuela?
Yeah.
It's grim. I mean, it's
people fighting in the streets. Guns.
Yeah, it's the failure of the state, and there are lots of places in the world where states fail, life becomes much, much harder. Our state is not going to fail, I don't think. And the challenge, I agree with you, it's more how do we humanize it rather than thinking that it's the thing that will protect the human. I mean, it's a possibility that it's the thing that actually has somehow lost its connection to the human because it's surrounded by things like it, corporations and other things, which are also robots and machines.
Yes.
We already live in a world that's dominated by artificial...
Already. It doesn't matter what we're waiting for.
Yeah, exactly. And those are the ones that are going to kill us apart from anything else. I mean, it's not like the killer robots aren't going to kill us.
Yeah.
States and corporations have the power.
That's us trying to just dramatise it. It's easier to think of a flesh-eating robot, apparently, which already exists, one that can fuel itself on human. Yes, you're right that it's already happening. That probably even what preceded this type of power was like, what are the sort of indigenous beliefs that we have as human beings? That like sort of even in pre-agricultural societies, when we'd have gone, right, there's 75 of us, you do the hunting, you do this, I'll do that. Like that we would have nominated some totemic idol or some natural phenomena to represent ultimate power or power beyond us. And then increasingly our religious systems have reflected the means by which we've got food, sort of agricultural gods replacing the hunting gods, ideological gods, 20 centuries later replacing the sort of single gods that accompanied sort of nationhood and now, so we've always had it in us, the idea that we nominate something to be powerful, and it just, I suppose, is an obvious trend that thing will move further and further away from most people as it becomes one landscape, as the world becomes a single landscape. More and more of that power will be, and I suppose the reason that we're all so fascinated with the internet is it's a modern phenomena, and it's happened so quickly, so we can see how, oh look, there's going to be this thing, the internet, where we're all going to be whoever we want to be. Oh fucking hell, it's owned by 5 people. Like, when did that happen? Yeah.
But so I think the big challenge is that the democratic state was that thing that we built, but that we told ourselves this is the one that we control. So it's not like the god, it's not like those other idols. So yeah, it is a kind of idol, but we still are persuaded, I think, deep down that it's the one that we built for us, and that we've lived with it because it's the machine that we control. And I think recognizing the ways in which we've lost control of that machine is really hard, because we did control it for a while, and there are periods where we do regain control over it, but there's a real danger that we kind of cling on to that illusion way past its selling point.
When you say we, it assumes a kind of a majority, doesn't it? Like sort of like, say, for example, if you take a good example with me, not educating this kind of stuff, but my guess is that immediately post-war, there's like, right, we're going to properly invest in you lot. Thanks for that. Like, that was a sort of a we moment, wasn't it?
Yeah, and the other, it's a depressing thought. War is a huge part of that story. You don't, part of the contingency of it, part of the relative brevity of that success story is it was predicated on 2 world wars. And if you strip the world wars out of the story of the 20th century, you do not get the democratic success story. So what you said is completely central. So let's assume that there isn't going to be another war like that.
There's no need for democracy like that.
We're not going to be able to tell ourselves that story ever again.
Yeah, like that. We're a good country. That's a bad country.
And we did this together. We genuinely did it together. And now the thing that got us through this is going to deliver for us.
Yeah,
that's not coming back.
In a way, though, David, I would argue that it is similar to sort of as a paradigm. It's like saying there is a loving God, and the loving God cares for us. There is in England. We are England. England loves our Britain or whatever, and. What it feels like now is like that in this materialistic post-secular society, we can't look to nation and increasingly anything to say that this is what unites us and bonds us. And even the idea of our shared humanity is becoming complex on both the left and right. On the left, because of various forms of divisionist identity politics. On the right, because they've always required
for the usual reasons.
Yeah, don't need to go into that. And then that's the other reason why partly the reason I sort of feel like we need smaller decentralized systems is one, my optimistic belief that human beings can look after themselves and one another, but probably only in small groups, because otherwise we are subject to cultural influences that we just don't like and can't get our heads around. And I feel that in a world where we have that kind of access to information now, there's always going to be a reason for enmity, largely irrelevant enmity, because I feel that it's mostly abstract and in the case of, say, immigration, and heightened precisely to create further division. So I feel like that if you went, well, all right, if the people of Grey's Essex just govern Grey's Essex, and the people of Darlington govern under and whatever kind of confederacy we have among ourselves, and whatever dominant ideals we have on a bloody federal or national level, when we can agree that we want sort of roads to be maintained and that we want some kind of police force and army, don't we? I guess I can't see how we can maintain 60 million strong groups and 300 million strong groups when there's just increasing, you've said yourself, haven't you, fragmented society.
Yeah, but the enmity's still going to be there. So, I mean, that's the other thing. You can't, I'm enough of a sort of, I think, political realist to think that there's always a danger with the thought that you can kind of locate it somewhere and take the enmity out. You've got to, and some of the enmity will, you can localize it, you can decentralize it, and that would, no question, give people much more of a sense of shared belonging. But some of it is going to move up and away as well. And it is possible that future that I mentioned, which is both more decentralized, but also in some sense, some of it has just gone.
It's gone anyway. It's already happened.
It's gone anyway, but we've got to recognise that the managing of human conflict, which there'll always be the potential for human conflict, we won't be able to do it all by localising it and decentralising
eating
it.
Vegetables.
And it's still going to be a political world.
I know. I think you're probably right, unless there's some terrible cataclysm.
He says cheerily.
We can't go out on that terrible cataclysm. Yeah, that when you said it the first time, that idea of we should recognise that there are something, but that's long been the case. I suppose something like the Iraq War was where for a brief moment that came into focus. Like, hold on a minute, what's this about again? Why are we doing this? And how is this democratic? And
But I think you and I agree that the threat at the moment is that we're pulling both the things that have gone and the things that we could root in our lived experience are both being pulled to this middle level of the democratic state and its institutions and elections and so on. And somehow we've got to let the things find their level. And at the moment, everything is still at that level and it's not working.
Yes. Well,
so more cheery note.
I don't know
Didn't
how
say cataclysm.
The problem, yours is better than my cataclysm ending. At least yours wasn't a call for an apocalypse to cleanse.
No, I'm not. It's a separating out. We're in that process, but our minds aren't there yet.
Can't you tell us something optimistic about being in that university? Isn't it jolly or something?
It's quite nice, yeah. And there are all these young people and they genuinely believe that, and I hear it all the time, that people like me can't see it. And I'm aware I probably can't see it. And the thing that I can't see is what an open future looks like.
Yeah, I suppose maybe...
It's hard at my age to see the future open.
Yeah,
but we try, don't we?
Perhaps that's right. Hold on a sec. I think we have engineered potentially, technocrats that we are, engineered a potential positive ending, David, and this is it. Perhaps we have to be comfortable with the idea of an open future, the idea that we don't have the solutions, that they won't be entirely resourced from the past. But perhaps, I suppose that for me, I need to believe that there are, in perennialism, in some sense, that there are certain values that human beings can return to, and I suppose many of them have been popularised through, e.g., Christianity, like the principle of fraternity charity and solidarity and service and sacrifice. That's why I continually look at, I suppose, spiritual ideologies as to see how these things can intersect with the way that we govern, with the way that we are governed, with the way that we organise. How can these principles influence? Because otherwise, if there's no recourse to fairness, then what is it we're trying to build? And I think that's the problem that we're confronted with.
And I think in that, it's to see the political future as open that's the challenge. I think most people do have that sense that there's something that should connect us across time, but we've got that frozen feeling about politics, and we've sort of forgotten that the future is more open than the past because the past has happened. We sort of think that our future is some mirroring of the past,
yes.
and it's not. And in politics, embracing an open future is the thing that we do need to do.
It has the sort of blind optimism that could become a political slogan. Embracing an open future. Let's embrace the open future together. It sort of sounds good. Doesn't really mean anything. Doesn't really commit us to anything. If we hired Steve
Bannon, he could get us elected on that slogan.
He would. Don't mention any of your progressive liberal beliefs if you have them, because Steve is not pro those.
No, he's not so keen. But he likes a good slogan.
Slogans, yes. Diversity, sadly, no. Oh, lovely. Hey, I've actually I felt like I was very, very, those machines that push 2p coins over the edge down the arcades. I feel like information was being pushed to me in manageable sizes, wave after wave of, yeah, that makes sense. Yep. So I was literally learning. So I think that's
great.
Precisely
I hope it was in the spirit of what you do.
Thank you very much. It was.
Great.
Yeah. Cheers,
Good.
David. Thank you.
Yeah, these conversations matter.
I think so. Thanks for watching this podcast and going all the way to the end of it. Would you just kind of to click the bell? It might not be there, because over there. And subscribing so that we can infiltrate your serenity and peace of mind with jangling bells and buzzes. Thank you.